Good evening. My name's Chris Hollins, and I work for Risk Audit Professional Development. And this is the first event we've held like this. We're partnering with our friends at Morgan McKinley here to bring to you tonight a special event. We hope it's not the first of those, which we've organised with a CIF. As most of you know, we're a training company and we don't do recruitment, but we're delighted to actually work with Morgan McKinley on this because we believe that training people who are actually coming through the internal audit profession is very, very important. I've been working with Risk Audit Professional Development for a couple of years, but tonight we're going to be talking about behaviour in banking. And by behaviour in banking, we're talking about things like conduct risk. We're also going to be talking quite a lot about something called culture, which is probably one of the most interesting topics around internal audit today. And it's at this point that I want to introduce my colleague, Sandro Boeri. Sandro was the founder of Risk Audit Professional Development some 12 years ago, and he's the major trainer in the company. My job within the company is to build webinars, and we're going to be bringing out a webinar program very shortly. We've got 8 or 9 already, but they're an alternative to the sort of classroom training that we normally do. One of the things you should note about Sandro is he walks around with an iPad in front of him. I just want to actually dispel the myth that he's just checking his emails, which is something that puts off most people who are watching lectures and things like that. He actually keeps his notes on there. He's an incredibly digital person. And he may well spend the first 5 minutes or so going through his notes here, because I think he's got some very topical things which I think you want to hear. But what I think we should do now, I'll turn it over to Sandro, and he's going to take you through behaviour in banking. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much for coming here today on a wonderful sunny evening. How many of you are feeling optimistic this evening? Could you please put your hand up? Fantastic. Coming back into a recruitment business, I'm sure some of you know I used to be involved in recruitment. I used to be a very moody individual. I used to veer from deep depression to great optimism. Deep depression is when a candidate was on the verge of accepting a job, and then they rang you to say that they were talking to their wife and their wife was having some second thoughts. That was a deeply depressing experience. What was a great experience, however, was sometimes trying to make a change to people's lives. Actually, when somebody said to you, thank you, that job is exactly what I wanted. It's been life-changing. I've got lots of job satisfaction. I'm very happy. It was a deeply self-satisfying feeling. What I think we need to reflect on today is what sort of mood, what sort of atmosphere do we want to take forward in our jobs? Do we want to live in a culture of negativity, a culture of fear, a culture where everybody is scared to actually say what they really think? Or do we want to live in a culture where people are honest, transparent, pragmatic in the sense that they realise that the world of banking is broken and perhaps needs to be fixed to a degree, but people realise that there is space to have an honest conversation? And I think we have a choice as the third line of defence, the internal audit community. Quite difficult if you're sitting in a bank such as, for example, Deutsche Bank today agreed a settlement. I don't know whether any of you have heard the news, but it's $2.5 billion settlement in relation to allegations of the rigging of foreign exchange rates. Can I just ask you to imagine what it must be like in a dealing room in Deutsche Bank next week? Does a $2.5 billion fine incentivise traders to be transparent? Incentivise that trader who is wondering whether something is market abuse to go along to their manager and to say, excuse me, sir, I think I may have made a mistake. Can we talk about it? Or does a $2.5 billion fine actually encourage that trader to say nothing? So it's a rhetorical question, but I'd just like you to consider what we are doing to the banking industry at the moment. I'm going into what I call the legacy phase of my career. I don't want to be in banking for the rest of my life, but I've got a feeling I've got another decade or so. And I'm choosing to make a choice. The choice I want to make is focus on what is positive about banking. I was coming back a few days ago from Paris and the Channel Tunnel. That Channel Tunnel wouldn't exist if it wasn't for banks. I was looking at Sky Television, beamed to you with a piece of metal 23,000 miles above us. Those satellites wouldn't exist if it wasn't for financiers that actually financed the companies that put satellites into space. I'm fascinated by mobile banking. I was fascinated by First Direct many years ago, and I'm still fascinated that I can ping some money from one organisation to another. Barclays, by the way, are not paying for this particular evening. That fascinates me. I'm actually fascinated by the mathematics of securitisation. I think securitisation is in the public interest. I'm fascinated by credit default swaps. All of these instruments are in the public interest if they're actually properly used. So we have a choice. We can wallow in negativity, or we can try and see the positive side of life. So what on earth has this got to do with this evening? Let's wallow in negativity. One of my favourite films is The Wolf of Wall Street. Any of you seen The Wolf of Wall Street? Great film. It's one picture of culture in financial services. It's a picture of the mis-selling of pensions, mortgages, insurance products, interest rate swaps. Can you believe that I was talking to a gentleman last week who still believed that there was only one leg to an interest rate swap, the defensive leg? Didn't believe what I was saying. There's two legs and you've missold the product. No, you're joking. We live in a world of market abuse, insider trading, market manipulation. Not too sure what to make about that story of that guy in Hounslow. The fact he managed to post bail to the tune of £5 million tells you that whatever he was doing was potentially relatively successful. But did he cause the flash crash of 2010? And then we come to LIBOR. LIBOR for me was a shock. Would banks really manipulate interest rates to that degree? Could banks really manipulate interest rates to that degree? And the answer is clearly they did. But I thought to myself, that's probably it, until the FX rigging situation came along. And bear in mind that the foreign exchange rigging, the activities, most of these activities were going on after the global financial crisis, after regulators had started naming, shaming, and fining institutions. So, let's talk about some root causes. Everybody tells me that human beings are greedy and traders are terribly greedy, and greed is the root cause of all of these problems. But are these people really motivated by money? Or is it the possibility that people didn't understand what was going on? But why didn't people understand what was going on? What was the root cause behind very intelligent human beings not wanting to bother to try to understand? One of the things I noticed in a lot of training courses that I run is you don't always get the most senior auditors coming into those training courses. Is that because they understand the subject intimately? Or is there some other reason? Is there a loss of face that is actually at play here? One of the root causes of some of these problems is it's actually quite difficult for a senior banker to put their hand up and to say, I don't really understand. We see an awful lot of herd-like behaviour. If it's good enough for that organisation, it's got to be good enough for me. Somebody said to me recently, we're talking about how to audit culture. A very senior auditor said, why would I want to do something different to what that bank down the street is doing? If I do what that bank down the street is doing, then I'm beyond criticism. There's safety in numbers. Is that really the world you want to inhabit? There is the question of status. there are still people coming up to me saying, could you please sign this passport application because you're somebody in society, you're a banker, aren't you? I don't bother correcting them to say, well, actually, I'm not employed by a bank, so I presume I'm no longer a banker. Therefore, I'm not qualified to sign that particular passport application because I'm not a trustworthy person. To be a banker used to represent status in society. I would argue that status is an enormous motivating factor in the financial services industry. But what about stakeholder pressure? Pressure from institutional shareholders, perhaps? I noticed 2 days ago, Goldman Sachs announced a set of results where they made a 15% return on equity. That's fantastic in today's world. But what's going on inside that organisation that is pushing that particular investment bank to that degree? So we need to decide which direction we go in. We can go into the following direction. We can wallow in fines, and at the moment, that is the regulatory tactic. If I keep on hitting you over the head, if I keep on fining you, you will get it and you will change your behaviour. That's the regulatory tactic. If I threaten to take your licence away, you will eventually get it. I may even jail some of you. From the 7th of March next year here in the United Kingdom, the theoretical possibility exists of certain bankers going to jail for nothing other than management incompetence under the PRA and the FCA's new senior managers regime. But will the threat of jail actually make any difference to anybody? I can claw back your bonus. Will that motivate you to actually change? What about some more rules? I was working with a client yesterday where part of the assignment was to engage in the propaganda campaign, which was to speak for half an hour on their internal policies and procedures project. And I had a little speech where I had to read out the word that they were introducing more rules. Does that do it? What about whistleblowing? How do you feel in this room if there is a whistleblower that's listening in to what you're up to, listening into your conversations, getting very excited when you've had a few glasses of wine because people open up a little bit and then they're going to report back to base? How does that make you feel? Does it make you want to share openly what's going on in your head and in your mind? What about surveillance? I mean, we have the most wonderful technology at the moment. I mean, I'm a tech freak. I love technology. And I'm fascinated by the technology of Big Brother that we're seeing in dealing rooms at the moment. But how does it make you feel if you're being spied on? That's the world we live in at the moment. Now, there are exceptions. I was talking to a senior auditor recently who was telling me about the open, collaborative conversation he was having with the Financial Conduct Authority. I don't know who he was talking to, but that's an unusual conversation. Will this world actually change behaviour in banking? Now, can I remind you of your responsibilities as internal auditors? Your responsibility is to look at business risk in relation to the long-term sustainability of the organisation that employs you. Will this world lead to a sustainable banking industry? I quite like that slide. Let's say no to negativity. Now, it's easy for me to say what I'm saying because I'm not employed by a bank. It's easier for me to say what I'm saying. But I'm about to attempt a logical argument as to what the alternative could look like. So let's start with this logical argument. When a human being is threatened with fear, that human being responds with one of the 3 Fs. That human being either fights, which in our world means engages in corporate politics. I'm so delighted I don't have to negotiate with people on audit reports anymore. I got bored with the corporate politics. It was pathetic. Whilst I understood why people were doing what they were doing, It wasn't a collaborative, positive exercise. Or the human being flees. What does that look like in the financial services sector? The human being mentally refuses to engage. Or the human being freezes. The human being conditions their mind to pretend that what is going on is not really going on. I mean, if you have a look at some of the classic tales of rogue traders, there are extensive periods of time where the rogue trader is actually in a state of denial. Their brain, through fear, is basically refusing to acknowledge the realities of the situation. I've never seen the auditee actually do that when I come into a room, but maybe you have. So, they are the classic responses to fear. They are the classic responses that we are now creating in our industry. Can I introduce you to the answer? There's an arrogant comment. Can I introduce you to the cultural risk management framework? As far as I know, no bank has this framework in place to the degree that I'm about to describe. Many banks have got some elements of what I'm about to describe. So what exactly is the cultural risk management framework? Well, first of all, it asks the question, what is the business risk that you are trying to manage? As internal auditors, we're taught to understand the corporate objectives of our organisation. We're then taught to ask the question, what are the key business risks? Well, one of those risks is inappropriate behaviour. The possibility that people behave in a way which is not suitable given what the organisation is trying to achieve. But at the moment, behaviour is being judged from the perspective of one stakeholder only, and I'll give you a guess who that stakeholder is. It's the regulator. But what about the other stakeholders? What about shareholders? Does a shareholder want you never to generate any more money again? Or does a stakeholder want you to maintain some entrepreneurial juice in your business? Could I ask for a show of hands? Do any of you believe that banking products need to be sold? Could you please put your hand up? We do need to sell. At the moment, if you use the word selling, it's almost a dirty word in the industry. Can I just remind you, I mean, I didn't understand what selling meant until I got involved with the recruitment business. And it suddenly occurred to me that selling is actually quite a lonely occupation. I'm sure a Sif will tell you. Selling is actually about being rejected every day of the week. Selling is about people saying no to you, or sometimes selling is about people not even bothering to get back to you. That's the life of a salesperson. Don't feel sorry for me or other salespeople, because when you get it right, you tend to be reasonably well remunerated. But if you don't like the word selling, should we talk about relationship managers? Many of you now are getting out of investment banking and getting into the world of private wealth. In the world of private wealth, you have relationship managers. They're salespeople, but they wear better suits. But they suffer from the same insecurities. If you have people that can sell whatever you call them, you need to nurture those people, not destroy their confidence, not tell them that they can't take a risk. Now, can I make sure that I'm being very clear? I am not advocating for one moment the mis-selling, manipulative, lying behaviours that we have seen in the past. Those behaviours disgust me, because I've seen the havoc that they actually cause. What I'm advocating, however, is that we realise that a banking business needs to be able to sell, and a banking business needs to be able to trade, and the culture that supports that type of activity is something that needs to be nurtured. While customers may not want bankers to sell to them, most reasonable customers will understand that if a banker smiles, and if a banker understands the customer's perspective, that banker has probably earned the right to attempt a sale. because ultimately a customer needs a bank, unless somebody's found an alternative. What about employees? We've got to think about the employee perspective. I was talking to this bright young thing last week, a very intelligent lady, first degree from Oxford, who got herself a job in a bank. And after about a year, she walked out. Why? I didn't like the culture. I didn't like what that bank was doing. I've got my whole working life ahead of me. She is what I would call a voting member of the latest generation of bright young things. If we're going to sustain ourselves, we need to make a compelling case to the next generation. So we need to think about the way we portray ourselves to that next generation. Our toughest stakeholder, I would argue, is the media at the moment. I don't know why, but the media doesn't enjoy telling good news stories. They only seem to enjoy sharing bad news. Apparently it sells papers. The problem is that the media has an influence on public opinion. And as we are about to discover on May the 7th in this country, public opinion has a massive influence on the politician. And the regulator reports to the politician. So there is a big link between managing the perception of the media. But what I would want the Daily Mail to report tomorrow is the wonderful initiative that a bank engaged in to finance a wonderful initiative that actually made the world a better place. If we believe that's never going to happen, we're in the wrong job. And then we have the regulators. I was talking to somebody from the FCA last week, somebody I've known quite a long time, and I was saying to him, do you actually enjoy beating up bankers? Does it make you feel better? It was over a glass of wine. And he said, not really. It's actually quite a soul-destroying job. Well, why did you get into this job? Because I want to make a difference. How are you going to make a difference continuing down this particular path? He then started talking to me about the culture of his own organisation. That's where I'll stop the story. The cultural risk management framework is a mechanism. As auditors, we like mechanisms. We're taught about processes. It's a process for, I like to use the word influencing rather than manipulating, but if you want to use the word manipulating, that's okay. It's a process for influencing human behaviour. If you're the chief executive officer of an organisation with 100,000 people, you need a mechanism for influencing behaviour. Because the alternative is you have a conversation with a regulator and you say to them, you know what, I don't have a mechanism for influencing behaviour. What does this mechanism look like? What could it look like? It looks at what I call the 4 C's. Let me introduce you to the 4 C's of culture, not risk culture, culture. C number 1 is create. It's about entrepreneurialism. As bankers, you need to make a decision as to the degree to which you want to nurture an entrepreneurial environment. An environment that nurtures salespeople, nurtures relationship managers, product developers, maybe even the second line of defence, maybe even the third line of defence. So one of the choices you have is to decide to what degree do you want to create culture. That's one dimension of culture. Dimension number 2 is what we call the clan collaborate dimension. Should we use the word team? To what degree do you want a team culture? There is a little myth. Goldman Sachs has always portrayed itself as a team-orientated individual. How team-orientated do you feel as a Goldman Sachs employee waiting to learn whether you've been promoted to partner? Are you hugging everybody? Are you collaborating with everybody? Are you saying to the person next to you, look, if you do A, B, and C, you will be promoted, even though I know that if that happens, I won't be promoted? Conventional thinking at the moment is to suggest that team culture is what it's all about. I think we need to think about what is the right culture given what we're trying to achieve. Some of you have worked in audit functions where the head of internal audit made a conscious decision not to encourage a team culture. Because he thought that would be the best way of actually getting human beings to excel. The third dimension of culture is potentially one of the most difficult to understand. We call it compete culture. It's competing externally against the market. It's trying to work out where you want to be in relation to a market. I talk a lot about Apple. Apple is a company that fascinates me. It's one of the most creative businesses on the planet. Apple went through a period where it had a zero compete culture. It didn't care about what anybody else was doing. If it had cared what everybody else was doing, it would never have invented this wonderful creature, the iPhone 6. It would just have mimicked whatever else was going on there. The final element of culture is what we're all getting used to, what we're all starting to measure. It's risk culture. The debate at the moment is totally polarized around risk culture. The first point I would like to make this evening is that if we only concentrate on risk culture, there is a very serious risk, very real risk, that we destroy everything else. The core elements of the framework require the board, the senior management team, to define the culture they believe they need to achieve their objectives. Now, clearly, if I'm running a mature banking business, the culture I need is going to be very different than if I'm running a startup business. The culture of Metro Bank cannot be the same as the culture of a bank that has an established franchise. Metro Bank is trying to attack the banking industry at the moment. It's a challenger bank. It has to be different. Having identified the culture we want, we measure the culture we have. Having identified that the culture we have is not the culture we want, we transform that culture. Sounds easy, doesn't it? So, let's talk about measuring culture. I remember a number of years ago, internal auditors were saying, I don't understand these credit models. I don't understand these market risk models. It's far too complicated. It's statistical, mathematical, and I don't understand it. So what did we start to do? We started to employ quants. Any quants in the room before I insult anybody inadvertently? I'm going to pick my words carefully, I used to joke that if you hire a quant, don't hire one, hire two, because otherwise the quant's going to be sitting in the room very lonely because nobody can understand him and he can't understand anybody else. I'm sure that doesn't apply to yourself. We've got over quants now. Quants are normal. Let me introduce you to the new age quant. The new age quant is a corporate psychologist. The new age quant is somebody who understands the science of human behaviour. Understands that as a science, it's still imperfect. We're still understanding what it's all about, but also understands that if people are your most important asset, we need to understand people risk. So, we employ quants to come up with methodologies. When I talk about the 4 C's is a derivation of a methodology. We need to have techniques for measuring culture. The techniques need to be tailored to the organisation that we're trying to measure. The techniques involve talking to people. They involve focus groups. They involve questionnaires. They involve surveys. They also involve data validation. Based on this analysis of what people think, based on an analysis of carefully crafted questions supplemented by data, we can actually produce something that shows the culture of the organisation that we're measuring. Now, when you measure culture, you measure the facets of culture. Let me introduce you to the 6 facets of culture. What is important in your organisation? Where does your organisation place strategic emphasis? What are the dominant characteristics of your organisation? leadership is very important. Leaders influence organisations. I'm sure that that's not rocket science. Why? Because leaders have power, so therefore there are negative consequences. But leaders can also be inspirational. Can I ask, show of hands, any of you come across any inspirational leaders in the last couple of weeks? Please put your hand up in your organisations. Is that because you... Wow, excellent. Is that... David's an optimist, that's great, I'm feeling better. Because leaders are so powerful, we need to measure the impact of leadership, the type of leadership that we have. But management is different. Management is about processes. How does your organisation manage? What management styles does it cultivate? When we talk about the organisational glue of an institution, we're talking about what binds people together. How does an organisation bind people together? And finally, we're talking about how is success measured in the organisation. We collect data on those aspects. Having collected that data, we start to produce pictures. Now, in the ideal world, you have a conversation about what culture you want. In the real world, you provoke a conversation by saying to somebody, this is the culture that I think you've got. Happy? How do you feel about it? Now, what is that little chart saying to me? It's saying to me, if you look at the top, that we've got a highly collaborative culture. By the way, that's the cultural profile of an internal audit function that we were working with recently that's not represented in this room before anybody starts getting nervous. That's a touchy-feely, huggy culture. The department really likes itself. The people like each other. They actually bend over backwards to help each other. It's a function that's moderately control conscious. The QA function, the quality assurance function, debates, doesn't impose. It's a function that's moderately entrepreneurial, but doesn't believe it's entrepreneurial enough. It's a function that has more than a passing interest as to what's going on in the outside world. And for example, they have policies to refresh the management team in a kind fashion. Now, recently I was working with an audit function where the collaborate box was down at 5, the control box was going off the Richter screen, or the Richter scale, the create box was close to 0, and the compete box was close to 0. And I couldn't believe that profile. When I asked the person that gave me the data what's going on, he said, we work for a control freak, a boss who basically manages by fear, issues edicts, and fires people who do not comply. And the other thing about this boss is he doesn't care what goes on in the outside world. I said to the guy, you happy? He said, weren't you in the recruitment business? Is anything going on in the market? Is essentially what he said to me. Now, I don't know what the optimal culture is for an internal audit function. I don't know what the optimal culture is for a bank. I've got lots of personal opinions. What matters, if I'm looking at the cultural risk management framework, is that when we start to produce this type of risk information, that we actually provoke a conversation that forces management to define the optimal culture using some form of framework of this nature. How many of you got anything that looks like this? Because I know some of you measure culture as organisations. Could I ask for anyone, putting your hand up, if you're measuring culture holistically, please put your hand up. How many of you are involved in the management or the audit of that involves the measurement of risk culture? Please put your hand up. Starting to. Okay. What we're seeing in the industry is a focus now on the measurement of risk culture. We're not seeing too much evidence of the measurement of those other pieces. Having measured what you need versus what you want, the next challenge is cultural transformation. Cultural transformation tends to involve doing more of something and doing less of something else. Focusing more on one of the C's and less on one of the other C's. But there are trade-offs, and these trade-offs are critical to what I said at the beginning of this evening's little speech. I'm sure you won't be surprised if I say to you that more control culture gets in the way of a create culture. I'm currently reading a book all about Pixar. Pixar was one of the most innovative companies that came up with Toy Story. I'd never bothered looking at Toy Story, watching it, until I read the book. I've now watched all 3 films. I didn't realise it takes 5 years to actually produce one of those films. I didn't realise that it's 300 or 400 people working in an entrepreneurial, challenging fashion where they're having honest conversations. They're actually criticising each other's work without consequence. Now, I don't think that's what we're doing in the banking industry at the moment. We're introducing rules, more rules, with negative consequences. We're actually saying to salespeople, to traders, we're saying take less risk. We're saying be careful. We're actually saying to them, please don't come up with any new ideas. That's the message we're giving them. The chairman of HSBC, Douglas Flint, I believe made a statement along those lines in as politically sensitive a way he could, without actually saying, I believe he was saying, we're actually killing the ability of banks to actually sell products that are in the interests of society for these products to be sold. But you know what? Control culture can actually impede team culture. One of the ways you increase a control culture is you start to push delegation of authority up the corporate ladder. You take delegation of authority away from people. You centralize things that were decentralized. But what are you actually saying to the human beings when you do that? You're saying, I don't trust you. You're not putting it in those terms. But believe me, to that human brain, you're saying, we don't trust you. Trust is one of the essential characteristics of a team culture. So you say you want a team culture, but you're actually attacking the very essence of that team culture in the way that more and more controls are introduced. What are you saying to the dealing room when you introduce surveillance? You're saying what they already know, we don't trust you. Does anybody know what a great trader needs to be successful? And by the way, trading is still allowed. I know Volcker is saying that we mustn't engage in proprietary trading, but trading is still allowed, and I would argue that trading is still an essential characteristic of our organisation. If you don't have people taking proprietary risk, our markets will be completely disjointed, and it's happening. Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan has made that statement that liquidity is disappearing from our markets at the moment. People who want to take risk don't have a mechanism for easily passing that risk on to other people, or people who don't want to take risks, don't have that mechanism. That's now happening. What we're saying as we introduce this surveillance and this big brother stuff is we're saying, we don't trust you, which is actually killing the confidence of a lot of traders. I'm working with a number of traders at the moment who, to put it crudely, have lost I won't put it, this is being recorded, have lost the courage to actually take VAR, to take proprietary positions. If you work in a complex environment, and most banks are highly complicated human organisms, it's a process of iteration to get this cultural transformation right. We need to try things, we need to measure, we need to retry things, we need to measure. It's an iteration, and that's part of the transformation project. I'm currently working with an organisation that has been enhancing balanced scorecards and has been introducing a system of docking bonuses as a result of balanced scorecards. What they found was that the human beings were starting to manipulate the data that was going into the balanced scorecards. It's work in progress. But if we want to change behaviour, part of our cultural risk management framework has a process that defines what drives behaviour in your particular organisation. Now, this is where the conduct risk frameworks that we're starting to see are generating some fascinating data. If I was to say to you that money is not the main behavioural driver in even some of the most greedy trading institutions, would you believe me? Yeah. And that's exactly what these conduct risk management frameworks are starting to reveal. They're starting to reveal that things like status, respect, promotion, money, probably in that order, are the conduct risk drivers. The other complication is what drives conduct in one jurisdiction may not be what drives conduct in another jurisdiction. Some of you are working for multicultural organisations. Multiculture needs to be examined quite carefully to understand what drives behaviour. So, you've got some important data that you need to consider in designing transformation project. As an auditor, I need to look at leadership. We have things called leadership assessment tools, which effectively take your future leaders and put them on the psychiatrist's couch. It's called psychometric testing. And actually test whether the leaders or the proposed leaders or the future leaders of an organisation have the necessary insights, the necessary value systems, the necessary belief systems to make them the right leaders for your institution. If I want to design Leonardo DiCaprio's company, as portrayed in The Wolf of Wall Street, I need a particular leader, and it's going to be very different from someone who's trying to navigate today's regulatory waters, obviously. I follow tone at the top. Tone at the top are words. The Americans use this expression, walking the talk. I actually follow the trail. Are we walking the talk? If somebody's made a great speech, how has that speech been translated into action? How does the person that made that speech check that what he said or what she said has been translated into action? Do we have the audit trails? I look at recruitment processes. Obviously something which, if I'm partnering with a recruitment consulting firm, I want that firm to understand what we are trying to achieve. I make sure that I've got processes in place that attempt to validate whether the people we are about to recruit fit the cultural profile that I'm trying to achieve. I look at education processes. I look at the training tools that we're actually using. Are these training tools linked to tone at the top? I'm a great believer that if you want to train people, you need to tell stories. It took me a long time to realise this as a trainer. But a lot of the training programs we run now tell a story. To what degree are you telling a story in your training materials? Does anybody know in what year Barclays Bank was actually founded? Anyone want to guess? Or what century was Barclays Bank founded? Any guesses?
The resistance from top exec?
No, but what year was Barclays founded?
16 something.
Yeah, 1690. How do I know? Because I was in a lift in Barclays Bank, and that lift was playing a movie reel that was actually telling me all about the history of banking, of Barclays. Now, why are they doing that? Are they doing that because they want to put something pretty into a lift? No, they're doing that because they want to start telling stories. This is not a fly-by-night organisation that's ripped the planet off in the last 10 years. Maybe it is, I don't know. It's an organisation that not only had my bank account from the age of 16, so that's about 60 years ago, that's actually a little bit less than that. It's an organisation that has actually traded quite successfully because it wasn't ripping everybody off. Going back to the 17th century, that power of storytelling is so, so important. You measure whether these training initiatives are making one blind bit of difference. Performance management is important. So as auditors now, we're starting to engage with performance management. But ultimately, there needs to be a consequences framework. And you have a choice. As an organisation, you can design a negative consequences framework, which is exactly what we have at the moment. Or you can start to design a positive consequences framework, where you start to reward positive behaviour. But you don't reward in secret, you make a big noise about it. Let me take you back to the conversation I was having with this regulator. He said to me, "What do you mean, Sandro? You want us to refund fines? We already give a 30% discount if somebody puts their hand up and says we've got a problem." I said, "Yeah, but they don't appreciate the 30% discount. They've come along and they've been open with you, and what have you done? You've fined them." If we look at Basel, the Basel framework, the capital adequacy framework, Pillar 2 of Basel allows regulators to adjust the amount of capital you hold based on, amongst other things, the internal control framework. What stops a regulator actually reducing the capital that you hold? But not only reducing it in secret, what stops them telling the world that they've done it because they think you're doing a great job? What I'm saying is, I'm not saying that Deutsche Bank shouldn't have been fined, or in the next few days, all of the other banks will be fined in the United States. What I'm saying is that at the same time that you publish negative news, you also publish positive news about good things that bankers are doing from a behavioural framework perspective. You're actually starting to change the nature of the consequences framework. Can I ask you just to reflect on internally how you encourage the positive behaviours? Just keeping a small eye on the clock. Artifacts are important. What do I mean by artifacts? Remuneration is clearly important. The structure of remuneration is important. Regulatory actions are artifacts. They're symbolic. Working spaces are actually very important. As human beings, we react to the environment we work in. I've worked with some audit functions where you enter the office and it looks like a chicken farm. How anybody can do any type of quality work in that environment is beyond me. I've also worked with audit functions that work in an expansive, collaborative environment. I say collaborative, I'm talking about the working space. It's designed to encourage people to work together. Team bonding initiatives, artifacts. So, who owns this framework? I believe it should be owned by the Chief Executive Officer. And I believe that the Prudential Regulation Authority are going to help us, because on the 7th of March, if you look at item 10 and item 11 of the PRA responsibilities map, you're going to need to put a name against the person that's responsible for culture and embedding culture. And if something goes wrong, that person, the burden of proof will sit on that person to convince the regulator that they were not incompetent in managing cultural risk. And by the way, the PRA document doesn't talk about risk culture in that context. It talks about culture. Some organisations have placed that responsibility in HR. I believe the role of the first line of defence is defining the culture they want and executing the transformational activities that create that culture. I believe the second line of defence is perhaps the function that should be held accountable for measuring culture. Shouldn't HR be accountable for something? I believe the second line needs to challenge the logic between the different stakeholder demands on culture, what the organisation is saying it wants to achieve, what the organisation is saying it wants. I believe the second line of defence has a responsibility to escalate situations where there are disconnects in those dimensions. What about internal audit? Can we go back to basics? At the moment, we're testing risk culture. That's not the way you audit anything else. You don't go charging and just test. You actually look at the control framework, don't you? We need to have the courage, first of all. Who's going to write that first line of the executive summary? We could find no evidence of a cultural risk management framework. How many of you could factually write that particular executive summary? But that's the issue. So, is there a framework? Is it clear who owns the framework? Is there an optimal cultural profile that's been defined? Is it aligned with corporate objectives and stakeholder expectations? Is there a measurement methodology, and is that methodology appropriate? Do we react to our measurement of culture? The upside, the sun. The upside is it dismisses what I believe is a ridiculous assumption. We're trying to turn everybody into control experts at the moment, including the salespeople and the relationship managers. Is that really what we want to do? Is that really what we should be doing? It's a framework that recognises that ultimately regulators are not going to make banks sustainable. One of the most disturbing features I'm seeing at the moment is a tendency for ex-regulators to be put into CEO positions in banks. Very disturbing. It recognises that if we don't sell, ultimately we don't survive. And by the way, there is competition out there. It's called Apple, it's called Facebook, it's called Google. I don't know whether any of you have played with Apple Pay in the United States, but our consumer banking franchises are potentially under attack. It actually provides an early warning signal if we have a cultural imbalance. If you've got the type of chart that I showed you, it starts to tell you whether you're getting too entrepreneurial, whether your controls are keeping up. That's if you believe the measurement methodology. Anyone know who that person is? Anyone else know who that person is? Anybody else? That's my dad. What on earth is my dad doing in this room? I'm doing a piece of work for a bank at the moment where I'm trying to remind them what a customer is all about. And I do it by actually trying to switch off the mind and turn on the heart. He's 90, he means a lot to me. But what is interesting about this gentleman is that you all have mothers and fathers, or you had mothers and fathers. You're all human beings with outside lives. You all really care as to what goes on in the world. And if you can reconnect the people that you employ with real life, you've got half a chance. This is an example of a technique that we're using with a particular bank to help that reconnection process, to actually make a siloed mentality redundant, to turn it into a mentality which is curious about what exactly that bank is trying to do in society. Anyway, we do all sorts of things in this world. We try and provoke. We try and actually help audit functions reach a consensus as to what they're going to try and do in this space. We train teams. That's an arrogant word. We lead workshops on auditing culture. We help functions measure culture and audit cultural transformation methodologies. Guys, thank you very much for spending an hour of your lives that you will never get back again. I really respect that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sandro. Ladies and gentlemen, clearly that was just a taster. If you want to hear Sandro talk some more about that, there are two ways to do that. One, of course, is to come on one of the courses. The other one is to phone him up and ask him to come in and have a chat with you, which, believe you me, he's more than happy to do. He loves talking about culture. He also loves that photograph of his father, which is always very interesting. Now, one person that I must introduce you tonight is Asif. Come on in, Asif. Asif is the gentleman, you better go and stand there so we can get you on camera. Asif is the gentleman who worked with us, and you can stand over there as well, and actually organised the event tonight. And we're very grateful for the opportunity to actually be able to work with Morgan McKinley and talk to internal auditors, we hope throughout the globe on this, But I think it's a chance for us to say a few words, particularly about recruitment, I suspect.
Hello everyone. I've always thought of recruitment as being, well, our way of actually helping the banks move in the right direction, bringing the people in. So, you know, altruistically has always been my thing. Mis-selling people, mis-selling roles, mis-selling opportunities. You know, I think that what we do is trying to help move the world in the right direction. So, you know, with Sandro's guidance, obviously we're trying to help everyone here. But thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sandro and Chris. Hopefully this will be the first of many events going forward. And hopefully you've learned quite a lot and enjoyed the evening. Thank you very much.